Yo, this hot, this the spot, there it is, pod.com. We're interviewing the best comedians, so tune in quick and get your ears receiving them. We talking about life and life to stream right to you, from the microphone right to your home, dude. Side note, this might get embarrassing, but no, don't sweat, yo, cause there it is.
Welcome to the There It Is podcast, a comedy podcast to help you find your inspiration. I'm your host, Jason Farr. Let's do this. If this is your first time listening, thank you. It's undoubtedly because of our guest today, Caissie St. Onge. You know that trending hashtag on Twitter, Obama commencement? Well, her son Lincoln started that. That's him. She and I talked before that went down, so we don't talk about it here, but how cool, right? She's had an interesting couple of weeks with that. I really hope that happens too. We need this. We need an Obama commencement. I bet he'll do it, but if he can't, then maybe I can't. Maybe not. The whole commencement speech would just be me going, look, hope. So let's just hope the real President Obama does it. As some of you know, this podcast started on June 7th of 2016 because June 7th is the day Prince was born, and I wanted to find a way to honor him. That was my way of honoring Prince. Caissie and I bonded over Prince on Twitter, and it just so happens that today is the 4th anniversary of his passing. This was not planned. She and I had actually been looking at a date to do the interview for months, so this is just how the cookie crumbled. I had no idea until yesterday, or I forgot, that today was the anniversary of his passing. So it's just kind of like a poetic thing that came out of this. A little Prince Majesty, I suppose. Fittingly, this conversation starts with us talking about Prince before we start talking about her illustrious career. She has so much awesome stuff to talk about here. She's really awesome herself. I really liked her a lot, but after this interview, she became one of my favorite people. So here's my chat with Caissie St. Onge. I don't remember exactly when we first interacted. I know it was on Twitter, and I know that we bonded over Prince.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, I was trying to figure this out earlier, trying to rack my brain. Like, I remember when we got associated, like when we started talking, but I wasn't like just going by your Twitter name and like your picture. I wasn't like super aware of who you were, and then I clicked and saw like a bunch of Prince stuff. I was like, she's awesome, she likes Prince, and then we like talked about that a little bit, and then I saw your work.
I know, it's weird. I do that all the time too. I just find that you find yourself having a rapport with someone, and then you realize like, oh shoot, I know a million people in common with this person, or like we have a million things in common, or like what is really super delightful is like you just enjoy talking to someone every day, and then for whatever reason you're moved to like really examine their profile one day. Some people would call it cyber stalking, but I just think you're like, I like this person so much, I want to know more about them and see what else they're putting out there. And then you just find out the most like super fascinating things about people, and I love it. And I'm like, it
is so fascinating because there was somebody who started following me, and it was like totally random, and I don't know how she came across my page, and she started saying like stuff on any jokes I posted, like her own jokes or whatever, and I was like, oh, they're cool. And then I followed them, and it was like, who is this person? So I looked at their bio, and I was like, oh, they're like a business owner or something, and she's from Mexico. And then I like Googled her to Google her businesses, and then I kept seeing stuff about like Jessica Alba, because I ended up being good friends with this person. Her last name is Alba. And I was like, oh, you know, when I Google you, Jessica Alba comes up a bunch. And she goes, yeah, she's like a cousin of mine. I was like, what?
So funny.
You're like, yeah, I haven't seen her since I was a kid. Yeah.
That is hilarious. Yeah, I love stuff like that when you're just like, oh, okay, all right. Now I see all the connections, and it is such a small world.
Yeah. Let's talk Prince right now.
Sure.
There were some things that you've worked with. You mentioned something about having worked with the estate.
Yeah, actually, I mean, I wouldn't call it working with the estate, but they were just interested in throwing like a listening party for the originals album that came out. They were going to do a series of parties across the United States, and I'm not sure exactly how they were connected with me. Just they were like, well, people that we talked to were like, maybe you could host the Los Angeles party. And I was like, well, they said maybe you could host a party in your city. And I was like, you know that my city is Los Angeles and not Connecticut, Westport, Connecticut, because I had just moved to Los Angeles. And they were like, no, we know Los Angeles. Yeah, got it. And so, so the executors of his estate, the attorneys for his estate were like, okay, so we're in the planning stages of that. We're going to do a bunch of these across the country. And can you just research venues that you think would be great? And I'm like, yeah, that's great. That's what I do, So kind of. So and they were just like, they anything that you think would be appropriate. And I was like, well, what would be appropriate would be like somewhere that he dwelled when he was here. So I put together just this list that was super fun to research of every place that he ever stayed or lived when he was here in Los Angeles, any place he performed, any place he hung out, any place he recorded, and what they were then and what they are now, and what the capacity for guests would be and what the facilities were. And ultimately it ended up not happening, which is kind of a bummer. Because they just scrapped that plan to have like across the USA listening parties. But now I am completely equipped and qualified to give anyone who comes to Los Angeles a 100% accurate, historically accurate Prince tour.
Wow. That's pretty amazing. And I would love the opportunity to do that myself.
We should do it. I mean, it's so, I've try to go to Minneapolis, visit Paisley Park every chance I get. And so I've gotten to do like, sort of tours courtesy of other people that are from the area, but also self-guided tours for things that we wanted to see. And it's really, really fun. So
that's awesome.
It's just very cool. Yeah. One time we went to see the location of one of Prince's former homes, and it was like, so we had to like park on the side of the highway, and my friend and I were like, oh, we're going to like go up to the gates, and it's these really great gates. If you're familiar, they have a heart and a peace sign like welded onto the gates, and the gates are like oh my God, my dog. The gates are what are still left standing. The home's no longer there, but we wanted to like go peek at the parcel of land or whatever. And so as we got closer to it, we saw that like some big public works project was happening, and there were just like huge pieces of conduit, and they were like digging a trench, and just it was a lot. And we were like, my friend and I were sort of like, we're gonna have to climb over all this construction stuff to look, but we're towardly gonna do it. And so while my husband like waited in the getaway car, and so we start walking toward this conduit, and we're like, then guys like coming up to like walking toward us from somewhere out of nowhere, and they're like in hard hats and whatever, and we're like, oh shoot, they're like coming to fuss us and like kick us off the property or whatever. And they got up, and they were like, and we were like, oh hey, we just wanted to like look at that gate, and they were like, oh yeah, we were coming to move the conduit for you so you could get closer.
Oh wow.
And we were like, oh,
that's great. Wow. Yeah, I've not been there yet to Minneapolis to see. I mean, I've been to Minneapolis, but I haven't been to. I've been to Minnesota, not Minneapolis proper, and I will be at Paisley Park one day, but just haven't taken that tour yet. But a friend of mine took it recently, and she did the like whole VIP thing, and it sounded amazing.
Yeah, it's really great. I love to go for Celebration, which unfortunately is postponed or canceled this year, like everything. But that's so cool. It's just like a 4-day, kind of amazing, like immersive experience where you're just, it's kind of like on the idea of like if you're a fan of like Comic-Cons or things like that, but it's all devoted to like this one guy and so it's kind of cool, and you just get to my husband laughed because like there's a lot of like shuttling, like getting shuttled with buses from parking lots where you left your car to Paisley Park and all that kind of stuff. And like one time we got on the shuttle and like so many people that were going by were like, "Oh, hey, it's me, Luther from Belgium." And "Hey, it's me." And my husband was like, "It is like your high school reunion." And he was like, "Why?" He was like, "This is so fun and it's so cool to be with all these people, but you actually know all these people." And I'm like, yeah, of course I do.
Wow.
We've been talking for years.
Yeah. I do want to talk about your career, but I do want to know a little bit about your love of Prince. So when did that start for you?
I think when I was like 7 years old, I saw him perform on American Bandstand. I used to go to my grandmother's house. I had like teenage aunts who loved, anything they thought was cool, I thought was cool. And so I would go to my grandmother's on weekend days and watch American Bandstand with my aunt, and he performed "I Want to Be Your Lover" when I was 7, and that was it. And then my aunts had his first album, so when I was like, "This guy is the best, like I love him," they were like, "Oh, we have this album, whatever, like don't let your mom hear you listening to it or whatever." It's not even like, I don't even think, when you think of like the 70s and early 80s, like double entendre I don't think people were so, I don't know.
People were not picking up on it at all, I don't think.
Yeah, they weren't so hip to like, what everybody was saying.
I just realized what Sledgehammer was about. Like literally since social distancing started is when I realized that song is what it's about. It was an aunt who got me into Prince as well, because when I was little and she would come visit and we'd go driving somewhere, I just couldn't help when I saying like we went driving somewhere, just thinking, so we went driving down by Old Johnson's farm. But anyway, she had yeah. We went to we would go to like the movies, and she would put on either Michael Jackson's Thriller or Prince's Purple Rain, and we would all, like, when we got in the car, we would ask for one or the other, and we wore those cassettes out. But
oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's such a it's so interesting because like back then we didn't have like access to things we were interested in. It really had to come like with the help of, especially if you were younger, it had to come with the help of someone in authority. So in my case, like my aunts were in charge of the TV, and my aunts had like pocket money, so they had record albums that they bought that I had access to. And then like when the Purple Rain movie came out, like that's the kind of thing. I didn't go to the movies much. I think like before I started like dating in high school, I'd probably only been to the movies a handful of times. Yeah, and that is definitely not the kind of movie that my mom would have taken me to, but my parents were divorced, and my dad was not the best at making it to his visitation. So when he did make it, there was a lot of leeway, and as much as he could like try to spoil me or or be the good guy. And so I think he like missed a couple of weeks where he was supposed to pick me up and hang out with me. And so when he finally did and was like, "What do you want to do?" I was like, "I want to go see this movie," Yeah. And so he agreed, and we went to see that movie. And my dad was a huge music fan himself. Didn't know exactly what I was in for, but I really wanted to like unzip my skin and run out of the theater. Like sitting next to my dad watching certain parts of that movie, like I just could not handle.
For real.
I can't, watching like a weird sexy scene next.
No, that's always weird.
But I will say, like, to my dad's credit, when that last shot happened, my dad just looked at me and he was like, I was like, oh no, what's he going to say? And he was like, that kid is so talented. Thank you
wow.
for introducing me to him. And I was like, oh, okay, great.
That is funny, but also like so apropos, I feel like, of just a dad in that that situation. Like, yeah, I won't draw attention to the fact that maybe I shouldn't have brought you to this movie.
Oh my God. Yeah. It was far from the first or last place my dad should not have brought me that he did.
So I love that we got to talk Prince, had to talk Prince, but I want to talk about your career. So speaking of getting interested in things, how did you get interested in writing comedy? Like, when did that come about for you?
That was just like, I don't even remember. Like, I was a huge fan of the Muppet Show and the Dick Van Dyke Show reruns when I was a kid, and so like probably the Muppet Show before Dick Van Dyke, I'm guessing, if I have to like sort out like my cognitive abilities at that age. So it's probably like maybe 5, watching the Muppet Show, and I had I thought the Muppet Show was real. You know, like I thought it was a show that the Muppets were putting on. So that's where my brains were at. So over the course of watching that show, when I started to read when I was like 4 or 5, 5 years old maybe, and I saw people's names at the end of the show and realized that they were people's names and that they were attached to jobs, then I was like, oh, this is, okay, it's not that the Muppets are real and that they work on this show. It's that real people control the Muppets and put this show on and work. And then, you know, watching Dick Van Dyke, it centers around these people, you know, besides the home life stuff, I was interested in the work life stuff, which it centers around these people that write this comedy variety show. And there was a woman represented, and, so I wanted to be like Sally. So, yeah, so that just ever since then, like really little, you know, I mean, obviously everybody has moments where, and I was no different, where I was like, oh, maybe I want to be like a graphic designer or a fashion designer or some type of artist or a journalist or like a research scientist or something like that. But which is so funny that those were more my abstract, like maybe I could do that. But I think I always most naturally felt like I'm a writer and I'm a comedy writer and that's what I'll be. But, you know, if I really reach, I could be a scientist, but no.
Well, you know, I feel like if somebody wants to do both now, then I feel like there's a lot of opportunity, because there's so many people who are able to work on this or that who are not directly in comedy, but they're doing a comedy show. Like, I have a friend, he's been on the podcast, he's a veterinarian, and he uses humor a lot in his online presence. You know, like that's such a big thing now.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's interesting. It's interesting how many people are like, oh, this guy, like everybody, you know, you're always hearing like, I know this guy, he's a cop, he could be a stand-up comic. This teacher could be a comedy writer for sure. And it's probably true. That's one thing that's great about Twitter is there's so many incredibly funny, and a lot of them get incredibly popular on social media. And you're like, oh, what do you do? And they're like, you know, I'm like a systems analyst or whatever. And then, you know, that's really humbling as someone that has made a career out of doing that. But also, you know, when someone made a career out of it, that's the other part of it. It's like, it's not enough to just be funny. You'll have to like do the business side, which is
people got to do the work.
You know, you know, and that's a hard thing, because figuring out how to like get in or you know, figuring how to position yourself so that you can luck into it or whatever, you know, it's a lot of hard work. And I think that's the thing that trips people up the most. Yeah.
There's so much work that you've done. I'm not positive if you were in the writing world or production world first. It seems like it was writing first, though. But, well, you were an assistant at Late Show.
Yeah, I was Dave's assistant at Letterman, at The Late Show with David Letterman. And that was like right when the show started on CBS, when he moved from NBC to CBS. That's when I started as an intern in his office. And after my internship was over and I was graduated from college, which was simultaneous, he hired me to be one of his assistants. He had a handful at the time. And so that's where I started, like, and that's where I started writing jokes, when I was his assistant, just by being a pain in the ass and being like...
I wanted to ask about that because when I was reading about you, I saw that, yes, you were an assistant, but you were also contributing jokes. So that's how you got your jokes on air, was by pestering him about it.
Well, it was like, I pestered him about letting me, he was really big on writing letters. He's very old-fashioned, about, like, being, thankful and really proper, and, Miss Manners about stuff like that. So he was really big on writing letters all the time, and they were short letters. They came from him. The sentiments were from him, and they were typed on an old-fashioned typewriter, which was super frustrating to type on an electric typewriter when people were using computers and printers. But he would say, like, printers didn't look like typewriting back then, so he would be like, you can tell the difference.
Yeah, you can.
And and so I'm not ready for that. So they had to be typewritten. And so I was writing these letters, and then I got to a point where I was brave enough or dumb enough or didn't know any better to be like, well, listen, if these letters are all coming from you, shouldn't they be funny? And he was like, I guess, but they have to really be funny. Like, I'm not going to just sign, like, letters that have bad jokes in them. So get ready for feedback. So that was kind of, that was about how to write jokes effectively, because I would write these short letters with what I thought were jokes in them, and then take them to him, and he would read them over and get a red Flair pen. And really, it was like, just getting an MFA in joke writing, because he'd be like, like, you front loaded this too much, you telegraphed this punchline, you have to put the funniest word last. That's the way, that's the usual order of things. So all of these really, like, just comedy writing 101 rules he gave me, just through that letter writing. And then I would, like, take his notes and go back and rewrite the jokes to be better. And so that's how I learned how to write jokes.
That's
and then
amazing.
eventually I would, like, at the same time, sort of simultaneously, there was this writer, Bill Sheff, who was from Massachusetts, and he was always really great to me and really, like, took me under his wing, maybe because we had Massachusetts history. He'd gone to school in Massachusetts. And he just was kind of like that. Like, he was a stand-up comedian, and he had a lot of young comedians I know that really looked up to him, that he had taken under his wing. And so I was like, really just felt comfortable with him and felt like I could ask him anything. And then he would do the same thing, just give me feedback and tell me, like, what I could have done better and what he really liked. And then just one day he was like, he just came and he was like, I had given him a page of jokes in the morning, and he was like, listen, we didn't really have enough jokes today. So that was how that all started.
You were at Letterman, not like after your internship, for like 3 years?
Yeah.
And then where did you go? Did you go to Rosie's show right after that?
Yeah, it was, I was at Letterman, and, just back then it was a different time. It didn't really seem possible for more than one. I really wanted to be a writer, and I had, like, tried to sort of make that known. I think it was sort of known, but even though I was, like, getting material on the show in some ways, I was having a hard time, like, just getting anyone to see me as, like, the girl who gets lunch but also writes jokes sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard, and I don't know, I mean, obviously, because even Letterman has talked about this, and his I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I mean, he basically owned up to not being better about that. But
he and I have talked about it recently, actually. Interestingly. So that's kind of where we were, and I just got the feeling like, oh shoot, this is never going to happen here. There were women writers, but never more than one at a time.
Right.
And when there were like a dozen guys and one woman, and you knew that like woman's spot was already taken. And I liked that woman and wasn't trying to like,
you're trying to angle her out. Yeah.
Trying to think of a way to push her in front of a boss or anything like that. I looked up to her. So, so one of our segment producers left to be the showrunner of this new daytime talk show with Rosie O'Donnell that was coming up. And it's funny because he and I weren't like best buds or anything like that. We weren't at that point, just because we like existed in different universes kind of. But he called once he started at Rosie before the show started, and he was like, listen, like I promised Dave, and I even signed paperwork saying that I wouldn't hire anyone from Late Show to come work on this show. But he was like, but I'm getting to know Rosie and she's looking for an assistant, and I just feel like you would be like a great assistant for her. And if you're interested, I will call Dave and ask him if you're allowed to come and do this interview at least. And so I was like, okay, yeah, I want to do that.
Wow.
And yeah, and so, I talked to Dave and he was like, I don't want to hold you back. Like that's not something I'm interested in doing. So like, go do your interview and go with God and good luck.
Oh, wow.
And yes, so, which was cool. And I met with Rosie and we got along, and she hired me to be one of her assistants. And and that was an interesting thing too, because I didn't last very long being one of her assistants, just because we weren't a great fit in that way. But the interesting thing is, like, she really always like thought of me as a writer, I think. And right in my interview, she asked me, like, nobody wants to be an assistant. Like, what do you really want to do? And so I told her. And so she would always introduce me, even when I was like working at the desk in her office, like if someone would come by. I remember Colin Quinn like came by to visit her from Saturday Night Live, and she was like, oh, this Caissie, she's a funny comedy writer. And he was like, oh, great. And then, which was so cool, because then I know that he always had that in his mind about me. Not that I was like her assistant, that I was like an aspiring or an emerging comedy writer. So
yeah,
that was
I
really
guess
cool.
That must have helped in regards to what you were saying about people not seeing you as the girl who gets coffee. Like there's someone who's seeing you as, oh, this funny person.
Yeah, exactly. And like, and I was like, even like, oh, that's so interesting that you do that. And like, because that's not my job. And she was like, well, being a writer isn't your job. It's like what you are, So like,
oh, wow.
Do you write? And I was like, yeah, I write every day. And she was like, well, then you're a writer. Like, it's your paycheck doesn't determine who you are.
I love that.
Yeah, which was really great. And, and then I went very quickly from being like her assistant to when she decided like, maybe you're not the right assistant for me, because I was very precise and like really anxious about her being where she needed to be all the time. And she was more casual. She was like, okay, this is like probably not working out for me, but like, let me make you, I was made like an associate producer, for one of the departments, for one of the producers. And then very quickly I became a researcher. And then after like a few months of being a researcher, an opening opened up on the writing staff, and I did a submission and was hired to be a writer in the first season of the show.
Awesome. Yeah. Wow. There was someone I knew in college who I think worked there at that time. Really? It's been so many years since I've seen her, and I'm even brain farting on her name now. We weren't close, but she told me a couple of stories about working there. And one was about how sweet Robin Williams is.
Yeah, he was a really sweet guy. I remember him from when I worked at Letterman, because he would always like I would, at the Ed Sullivan Theater, the dressing room stacks are, just off to the side of the theater, and you have to like walk up and up and up these switchback stairs to get to every dressing room on every floor. And I used to stand outside of Dave's dressing room just waiting for him to like be ready to do the show, or after the show, ready to go back to the office or whatever. And so I'd just hang out there in case he needed anything to run and go get something. And Robin Williams would always, whenever he came around or whenever he came on the show, he would always just like hang out in that hallway and chat for the longest time. And he was just darling and sweet.
I love that story. How can you not love Robin Williams? So when you were there once you transitioned to writing for her, I mean, it was because people there recognized you as having that potential.
I mean, I think I was very outgoing in all of the other jobs that I had. I was always like, and we were lucky because you might know Andy Lassner from Twitter. He's one of the producers of the Ellen show. He was a producer at Rosie, and one of the great things about him was that he was always looking for ideas, like bigger ideas. It's funny because he wasn't like the top producer at Rosie. He was younger then too, but for whatever reason, he just always treated his job like it was the biggest job, and so he was always endeavoring to make that show more of a spectacle. And so he really was like a leader, even though at that time he was just like a supervising producer or whatever, but he was destined to be running the show somewhere. And so he was so great because he would just take a good idea from anywhere. So as many ideas as I had that I would like include in my research for ideas for guests to do or whatever, he would use them. And he was always really great about being like, that was Caissie's idea. Caissie came up with that. And, and like letting me try my hand at producing things. So I had like a couple of really successful segments they were just successful segments that had been my ideas. One I really loved because it was just, I don't know, we were looking for things to do with kids. Like Rosie loved kids and she wanted to do things with kids, but that is kind of a challenge because kids are sort of like unpredictable, and it can be hard to make them interesting. And, and you can get into, sometimes shows fall into a place where they want to do like a lot of human interesty things, but it can be really exploitive because a lot of the shows were like showing like a kid that like loves, a kid that like loves lawnmowers or whatever. And a lot of times that comes from like, something that isn't like a happy thing, like maybe a kid is struggling with something and it's like a weird lot of pressure. Like we would see parents putting a lot of like your kid's like, I don't know, like a bat expert. And then you find out that like, it's not that happy and that fun for that kid to come sometimes and talk about, so that we were in this weird place where we were like, sometimes this is really fun if the kid is super into it, but we were getting as a show into like trying to find out if kids were super into like coming on and playing the piano or whatever. And if they weren't, then we didn't want to like encourage doing that, Yeah.
And like, that must be hard because if you ask a kid, they're going to think, well, mom or dad wants me to say yes. So how do you even get through that?
Exactly. So Rosie was like super conscious of that. And that was an important lesson for us. Like I remember just being like, oh shoot, like a lot of these kids that we watch on these shows that it's so funny. And everybody loves it so much and they're adorable. But like we were learning that like, oh, a lot of these kids aren't really into this and this isn't fun for them. So we were trying to like turn away from that and think of something that we could do with just regular kids that didn't require someone to have like some type of expertise or some type of parent, like trying to put them out there to gain, momentary fame or whatever. So I had this idea where I was like, well, it's always so funny, like kids' thoughts on just whatever, kids' ideas about how old people are or like how you do something or how you make something. So I was like, what if we asked kids to come up with their like fantasy candy bar recipe? And, we could just ask a bunch of kids and then we could get a real candy company to make their fantasy candy bars, and then they could come on the show and demonstrate them, and that'd be like a fun segment. So we were like, Andy and Judy Gold, who was a producer at the show at the time and had been a writer. That. Yeah. They were like, yeah, let's do this. And so Judy was like, help me find these kids. So we went to a couple of schools and met with these kids that these like principals were bringing to us. Like they would hand out worksheets in the schools asking, in New York City schools asking like, what's your fantasy candy bars? And then what was happening is like we would go to the school and the principal would bring some kids that she thought were the best to come and meet with us. But we were like meeting with these kids and we're like, this is cute and they're nice, but it's not really like, it's not going to make interesting television. And I remember Judy being like, this seems like a good idea, but it turns out like it might actually be a dud and like, it's not going to be a good thing. And then I remember just being like, wait, let me try one more thing. And so I remember saying to the principal of this school, like, can I meet some kids that you would consider problems? Like, can I meet some kids that are troubling to you, that you don't see, that you don't see on the best terms every day? And can I see what the candy bars that they suggested? And she was like, I'm not sure if we want to reward that. And I was like, well, then we can I guess we'll try to go find kids at another school. And then she was like, oh, okay. And so then, because I'm thinking like, those are the kids that are always performers. Like whenever you ask a performer, how were you in school? They're always like, I was a nightmare. So then we got like this, this sort of ragtag bunch of kids in to talk to us about the candy bars that they were pitching. And then we were like, yep, these are the ones. And so we picked just this wild group of kids. And they were just regular kids, but they were so, so, so funny. And every single one of them had like the wildest story. And we had this candy company in New York City, Lilac Chocolates, made their candy bars. And they got to come on and demonstrate them. And they were all so funny with Rosie. And it was just, I felt so proud of myself that we had like cracked it and solved it and made this really great segment. And then the cherry on the top of this very long story that is probably not appropriate for your podcast is that
totally
Phil Hartman came on the show shortly after that segment aired, the candy bar segment, and he asked the segment producer, can I meet the person that came up with that? Because my kids and I watched it and we loved it so much. And so the producer brought Phil Hartman to my desk in the research office and was like, here she is. This is who thought of the candy bar segment. And he was like, so Phil Hartman telling me like, oh, my family watched it. We loved it so much. We thought it was so funny. And it was so great just to see like little wild kids like and their ideas of like what would be good in candy. And I was like, oh my gosh, such an honor to meet you. So great to meet you.
Sure, yeah, he's a legend.
And yeah, totally. And then like a week later, he sent me like pictures that his kids had drawn that I had up at my desk, the whole, hanging up on my bulletin board for the rest of my time there. Wow. But yeah, so that was the kind of work I was doing. And then sort of like a rumor went around that a writer or two were not going to be renewed or that they were moving on, like when that probably the second writing cycle, the second 13-week writing cycle was up in that first season. And so I just decided to like do a submission packet, like I asked someone to get their hands on the submission packet for me and I turned mine in and I just got hired to be a writer.
Wow. So you kind of went from what was your role like when you did the candy bar bit?
I was a researcher, so that job is like when, Julia Roberts gets booked on the show.
Right, and then someone researches
Exactly. You make like a dossier about Julia Roberts.
What they've done recently.
Exactly. Just everything. Like it was really comprehensive there at Rosie. I one of the last research packets I did was on Elizabeth Taylor, and it was really like writing like a grad thesis because she had such a long career.
Yeah.
And, and always the fear is that it was a live show and you want to send Rosie out there with every piece of information that there is to have about a person, and so, so Elizabeth Taylor had such a long career, and it was like such a huge undertaking where you're basically writing like this thesis on this person. And I literally remember hitting print on that, getting ready to like copy it and distribute it to all the producers, and Rosie and the booker coming in and being like, Elizabeth Taylor just canceled. And I was like,
oh, wow.
I literally screamed, and Rosie ran in and she was like, what? And I was like, nothing. And she was like, no, what is it? And I was like, nothing. It's so stupid. I had just finished Elizabeth Taylor's research packet and she canceled. And she was like, oh my God, of course you're screaming. I don't blame you.
Was it always that, the like research on that show always that intensive? Because I remember one time watching the show, Sting was on with his wife, Trudy Styler, and she said something like, oh, you're such a good actor. I really loved you in the movie Buster. And he started laughing, and she was like, what? And he was like, that was Phil Collins. And she was like, oh my gosh, I don't really do research. And I just go with my knowledge of people a lot of times on here. So it's funny that there's like so much research in the like being done, and that still happened once. That might have been years later, though.
It definitely happened. It definitely happened. But that's like your biggest fear. Like,
Yeah.
Do you remember, like, was it Kathy Lee Gifford asking Martin Short how his wife was? Was it Martin Short? And
after she had died. It had been like a year.
Yeah. And so, like, as a researcher, that is your biggest fear, like allowing something like that to happen on live television. And I'm sure, and sometimes it just happens and it's an accident, and like, no shade to Kathy Lee. Like she's researching, she's reading research on how many guests, I mean, not anymore. She's not doing the show anymore, but
had so much that she was going. That's
exactly.
That's a tough gig. And I even heard a story about a politician who I won't mention because he's not a good politician, but a professor of mine told a story in college once about my professor's dad was in politics, and he didn't work for this senator. It was I guess just on Capitol Hill in some capacity, and they had met. And so when my professor met this politician, he made nice with the politician and just said, I'm so-and-so, my father's so-and-so. And like years later, this politician sees my old professor just like standing, waiting for like a subway train or something. And the senator's looking at him like, oh, I know this guy from somewhere. And my professor sees him from the corner of his eye, just sort of like the senator just watching him. And then the senator walks up and shakes his hand and says his name and says, hey, how are you? How's your mom? My professor is saying this is what he was doing when he was looking at me. He knew that he recognized me. He was trying to remember where. Then he remembered when. And then he said, oh, yes, his father worked in Capitol Hill. His father is dead. Ask about his mom. Because his father had passed away since originally meeting that guy, that professor.
Right.
So you have to sort of have that sort of information on you when you go out to interview somebody, because that sort of stuff happens. You got to remember to think, okay, everybody may know this about this person. However, circumstances have changed, or there's new information to go with. And let's remind people of that when we interview them.
I mean, I'm sure he thought that I was nuts, but I worked for Andy Cohen for years on Watch
I was going to mention that. You were a producer there for years.
Yes. I was one of the co-executive producers of that show, and I was also kind of the floor manager because it was such a such a small show that our
Yeah, it started
showrunner
with
was in
like
the
4
control room.
people at first, and
Yeah.
you were one of those
Yeah,
4
one of
people, right?
one of the 4 people. And so I was the person who was always out on the floor, and I would always, like, right before the show went live, I would just be like, I know you read the research, but this person's mom has passed away, or this person just lost their dog, or, just whatever I knew, I would just, like, right before. And I know he was always like, you're insane. But if he had ever said, like, oh, how's your dog Bluebell doing? And to have someone say live on the show, like, well, actually, we just had to put her down.
Yeah.
Like, I just never wanted him to feel that. I never wanted, because I've been there when that's happened, and especially in live television. So, so that's what research is, basically. It's like a recap of someone's career, every controversy, every triumph, and for God's sake, please try to find out who died recently.
Yeah. It's a lot. It's a lot. Because I love going to watch tapings of late night talk shows because I'm such a nerd. And when I'm sitting in there, like, I love the shows and I love the comedy, but I really am watching the producers and the crew and the band and just how it all comes together. I'm fascinated with it. And seeing Fallon and Seth Meyers and Stephen Colbert, we see the segment producer come after before an interview or before another segment and just prep. And I just realized just how massive of a production it is. It's not, you don't get any idea that there are that many people there when you're just watching on television, because sometimes the host will talk to the band. They'll talk to, like Letterman had a couple of people off camera that he would talk to. Everyone talks to their director, but you don't know. That's like, the universal person does not know how many people are really behind the scenes there.
Yeah, so many people, like, you just, and I've always been that person, like, on the floor talking to whoever, talking to the host. That's a role that I enjoy, but there's also, like, a lot of times they're wearing, like, a little in-ear monitor, and there's a whole room full of people somewhere that you can't see talking to them, and it's about, like, a million things. It's about, like, that information and what the guests came there to promote, and getting them to talk about that in a natural way, but also, like, the way that your body is angled, and just a million things that you have to keep in mind, and also, like, in the context of, like, what's going on in the world, so doing, like, a day and date talk show or a live show, it's, especially if it's live, you're actually at an advantage because you're just reacting. Like, we did an episode of Watch What Happens Live the night that Bin Laden was killed. And it was so insane because Willie Geist, and I want to say, like, it was some Real Housewife, Alexis, from Orange County were both supposed to be on. Oh, wow. Yeah, and Willie Geist was like, I actually think, like, I have to go and see if they need me, like, at NBC. I don't think I can. And moreover, like, my producer self was like, for Willie Geist's career as a news person, I don't think he should be on this show tonight. Like, this should not be.
It would look so bad.
Yeah,
like,
you know what I mean?
What were you doing tonight? Yeah.
Exactly, just drinking cocktails and whatever. Willie luckily made that decision on his own, but that's where my head was at. I was like, for the protection of our friend Willie Geist, I feel like even if he wants to stay here, we should let him. But anyway, we went and just did. It was insane. Like, we actually kind of broke the news that Bin Laden. We broke the news to, like, to our audience anyway, that Bin Laden was dead.
Wow,
which is insane.
There's so much stuff that you have seen and done that, I feel like the average person has not, because you've had all of these different roles. Being an assistant, being a researcher, moving into writing, and you have continued to do that for years, but also producing on the side of that for so many years. There's so many different stories you have. I feel like you should write just you should be the next person to write a biography on television or something, or just
my
at
gosh.
least your experience in television, like the next Bill Carter or something like that. We're just like, well, here's some things that happened, because they're I just, even from not even just my nerd wanting to read that stuff, I think also it'd be like really educational for people.
Yeah, it's interesting for sure, and it's interesting to me just how much it all has changed, since I started. It's really been like a revolutionary time, and like they don't even call it television anymore. I don't think. I think it's just called programming or content now.
Yeah.
So I'm right there with like kids with YouTube channels trying to figure out how to get people to watch things that I make. So that is also humbling.
Yeah.
But yeah, I've been really lucky to sort of work on a whole range of really big deal network and syndicated shows and really smaller shows that have still made this like incredible cultural impact. The last show that I was like one of the developing voices of, with Busy Phillips and Tina Fey, Busy Tonight on E, that was a huge deal for me. Even though it didn't end up necessarily having a long run. I think it highlighted a lot of the things that concern me as a content creator, and also it might not have had the biggest audience, but the audience that we did have, I still get tweets every day of people saying like there's a hole in my heart, where it was interesting. I won't say the name of a person, but I recently had a meeting with a very famous person who was interested in doing something, and I wouldn't think that person would have been at all familiar with any of my work necessarily, because of the sphere that they exist in. But
yeah, I mean, like Best Week Ever is VH1, and then there's Bravo with Watch What Happens Live. So you just think maybe they wouldn't have known about you.
Yeah, exactly. But
yet they did.
But, yeah, and she was like, I cannot believe how she was just like, I'm sorry about Busy Tonight being canceled. I cannot believe how devastated people were when that show was canceled. And I was like, oh, thanks. That's so nice. And she was just like, no, but I mean devastated. She was like people get upset when TV shows are canceled. That is normal. But she was like, but everyone I knew that watched that show was devastated. And I was like, oh, okay. And I was like, that makes me feel good, but also terrible. But but yeah, that's still kind of how it is. Like, just it's like going on a year now, and it's still every day people are like messaging me like, I miss it. I kept every episode on my DVR, and
that's nice.
So that's a good feeling.
Yeah, and Busy seems like the best.
Busy is so great, and she and I still really work closely together on a lot of things and future things, and working with Tina Fey was wonderful.
She's one of my heroes. So good gosh, it's Tina Fey.
Yeah, she's so great. She's really just funny, but also really kind, and one of the things that I just love about her so much, and I don't think I ever told her this, but I worked a lot writing for Joan Rivers when Joan Rivers was alive.
Right, I wanted to mention that and talk about that. Yeah.
But Tina reminds me of Joan Rivers in the way that she's always interested in how other people are thinking of things. Like, you know what I mean? Like, she's not afraid to say, like, here's what I think, and she is just like an expert, and she's like a joke machine. You can't stop her. Like, if you ask her for help with a joke, you'll get 100, and they're all great and 100 times better than anything you could come up with. And so that's just incredible. But my favorite part about her is she's always really interested in how other people are thinking of things and seeing things. And I think that's in the interest of becoming even better at what she does. And it's just amazing to me because I I see people all the time that are like at the top of their game. And I think that they really think like, I have this cracked. I know what I'm doing. I can just continue on. Like I can coast on this and this will be like a very successful life for me. But Tina reminds me of Joan in that I don't think she's ever going to be that person. Mm-hmm. Like, I think she's always just going to be like, well, what do people think today in 2020? And what do people think in 2025? And, and Joan was like that right up until the end of her life. Like, she just kept evolving. So,
yeah, she had been around for decades, and she was always something to pay attention to and to listen to, always someone who put something out that people cared to listen to, and not just people of her generation, but just anybody.
Right. She just came from this generation where it's interesting because, the more that we become like sensitized to the plight of other people, or I guess what people like to say that's being woke, you get to be more woke, or other people would like pejoratively say that's being politically correct or whatever you want to call it. I think it's really just becoming more sensitive to having feelings for and listening to people who maybe aren't exactly like you, and and believing what their experiences are, and and not wanting to do anything to harm people. And so like I think I think a lot of those people would probably like go back and look at something that Joan said, at one time, or, many things that she said and be like, oh, she's problematic. Which is true. Like a lot of the things that she said in the past wouldn't hold up in 2020. But the thing that was amazing about her is that she was never like, if she did some bit or whatever that like caused outrage or whatever, I've heard a lot of comedians that are like, oh, screw that, politically correct. You can't say anything. You can't say a joke anymore. She was never like that. Like we would have talks where she'd be like, I did this bit, it kind of fell flat, or like I took some heat for this bit. But let's talk about like what it is. Like let's inspect like what it is and what about it upset people. And I think she was coming from it like, I want to say something, like I want to make a joke, but for her it was never. One of the reasons I loved writing for her, and one of the ways that I love to write, is like it's not just sometimes it's enough just to make a funny joke. Like if it makes you laugh and it's funny and it delights you, that's lovely. But like when you're trying to make when you're trying to make a statement, you're trying to like have some cultural impact. It's not just enough to say something funny. You have to be saying something that is also funny. And so that was a lot of what Joan was doing. And so she always had like her reasoning for something, and whether or not you agreed with that reasoning, okay, then, but she was always willing to have that discussion. And so I really felt fortunate because I also evolved as a writer. A lot of that stuff that I wrote early on would not hold up, and I would be like ashamed if I knew, if I went back and read a lot of it today, I would just be like, this wasn't cool, but that's I know true. Better now.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a it's true for a comedy of any era. It's stuck in its time period, and it's not in the same context as as today is. I mean, there's some stuff that can still play, but it depends, and especially if you're trying to especially if you're trying to say, I don't know, if you're like a Joan Rivers or a Don Rickles, like you're trying to be a little bad, but that context of what's bad at that moment is so different.
Yeah, you're trying to be edgy and, and trying to be memorable and to say something. And I think that's where, when you apply all these lenses to it, well, when you apply a lot of lenses to something, sometimes the danger is you wind up saying nothing, which is like, that's not great. That's not funny or interesting. And also it's not really helpful sometimes when there's like a problem that we see in the world, to just be like, well, it's all too complicated, so I choose to say nothing. I don't think that's a great position to be in, but sometimes when you say nothing, you can listen better and you can hear and you can learn, especially if you're willing to like really take in what someone's generously offering you about what they've experienced. And so then you can like apply that. And, you know, and people say all the time, when you know better, you do better. And there was a time when we didn't know better, and maybe we should have, and maybe that should have come along faster. Maybe we should have evolved on that faster, but and that goes for like talking, you know, for like doing humor about anything, including yourself. Like there's a lot of things I think that Joan would do material on that wouldn't fly today, that was about herself, you know, just because she was so I just think it would be painful to people to watch her be so tough on herself. She was toughest on herself. But anyway, yeah, she was, a lot of material is stuck in time, but she was never stuck in time as a person. She was really, 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 just always trying to learn and always trying to evolve. And that's the part of her that I see in Tina. And also, she was just like Joan Rivers and Mr. Rogers were like the two people I think that I've ever met in my career that really could just like see into your soul.
Oh, wow. I was really just thinking about Mr. Rogers. So when did you meet him?
Mr. Rogers was a guest on Rosie a few times. And I worked with him both times. I think he was on 2 times when I was at Rosie, and I think that I worked with him both times. And I don't know why exactly I worked with him, like whether he was wanting to sing like a song that I had written or something, because I wrote a ton of music at Rosie, a ton of songs and song parodies. But I also just think it's like one of those things, like everybody at Rosie knew that I had an interest in children's television, and that's why I started, and that like, you know, Sesame Street and the Muppets and Mr. Rogers were big deals for me. So I'm sure it was probably just like somebody being like, Caissie loves Mr. Rogers, let's make sure that they have, have some time together or whatever. So anyway, he just was like really great, and was like, if you ever find yourself for whatever reason moving to Pennsylvania and you want to work for us, that's an option, you know. Just very cool. And like we stayed in touch a little bit. And when I had my older son, he sent like an amazing care package from the land of make-believe, and we still have all the puppets. And
that's so sweet.
You know, just a really like very sweet and incredibly thoughtful, like just everything you've ever heard is exactly who he was. And you know, and really made a huge impression on me because like of the Rosie show, the kind of show that it was, and because of things that I like picked up from, you know, the Rosie show was about bringing joy to people and, you know, just letting people like let loose and embarrass themselves and kind of let their like nerd and freak flags fly. And I think it really informed, like, I don't think you get a Jimmy Fallon without a Rosie O'Donnell.
Yeah. I mean, really that was automatically what came to mind was, because you said it was about bringing joy, was like, that's all Jimmy Fallon is about. I read a quote today where he said that. And I think Ellen also is similar in that regard of just like trying to like bring some joy to people and a little bit of happiness.
It's interesting. I've talked to Rosie about it a couple times, and she's so great. I mean, the people that make Ellen are a lot of people that make Ellen are people that worked on Rosie and Andy Lassner, especially. Yeah. And Mary Connolly was one of our segment producers at Letterman, so I know her from there. So I always like, you know, Rosie chose to retire from the Rosie show. And she just kind of had enough of like, just, it's very hard to make 5 shows a week and 5 live shows, and she had her kids, and So she made that choice to kind of walk away from it. But I have asked her in some of the times that I've seen her, like, when you see Ellen, like, is it ever like a little bit of a rock in your shoe that it is kind of like the show that you were doing?
Kind of like Key and Peele was for Dave Chappelle.
Yeah, maybe. And she's always like, no, I'm so happy for her, and it's so exciting, and that's so great. And I'm like, that's great. I'm glad that she feels that way. But it is a really similar show in that way. But, when your whole mission in life is to bring joy to people, like, I guess that ownership isn't, like, super important. And I hope that she knows on some level that, yeah, I don't think an Ellen DeGeneres exists without Rosie. I don't think Jimmy Fallon exists without Rosie. And so that's what that show is about. And then Watch What Happens Live was about, like, actually bringing people, these super fans of these shows and these people into the process. And so Andy would always say, like, people just want to be heard. And that was a really important lesson for me too. So these are all things that I took, like, to Busy Tonight, and just that people want to feel joy, and people want to be heard, and also that people want to be seen, and women want to have a show that's made expressly for them. And if men want to watch it, that's amazing. But, most of the show's defaults are made by guys for guys, kind of like just, by the nature of who's hosting and who's behind the scenes. And then, like, if a woman wants to sit on the couch next to a guy and watch it, okay, cool. But it's not for her,
Right.
So that's what we were kind of trying to do with Busy, and just make people feel joy, and make people feel less alone, and make people feel heard. And so,
I think that's why people were devastated by her show by your show with her getting canceled, because it was a voice for people. I mean, I guess part of the reason her show existed was because of what she was doing on, was it Instagram? Like some of her experience there, which is, I mean, that's social media is, I want to be heard myself, and I'm going to connect with other people who express something I relate to. So, that all tracks. And, I was going to mention, seems like there was a portion of your career where you were writing primarily, and then there's a portion where you were doing a bunch of production work, like, when you're working at Watch What Happens Live. And then there's this time where it's both, where you're doing both, like with Best Week Ever or Busy Tonight, like you're utilizing all of the things that you've learned from all these different people. I mean, you had, even going back to Letterman showing you how to write a joke. Yeah. Which is an amazing story.
It's really lucky. It's really lucky to be able to, like, just to know how to do both of those things. And we didn't talk much about Best Week Ever, but that was such a fun time in my life, like, to be working with people that were, like, some people who were, like, my personal, like, not just, like, historic personal heroes, like Joan Rivers, obviously she's world famous or whatever. But, like, when you're just talking about, like, pure comedy skill and, like, who was the biggest deal at the time, like, to work with Paul F. Tompkins was someone that I was just like, he is my comedic ideal, and his evolution as a performer is my comedic ideal. And so to, like, get to work with him and write for him and be friends with him was amazing. And then a lot of these people that were just starting out, that I was like, at some point, I don't know how this happened. I was like, I came in to write on the show, but I was also older, and I had worked on some bigger shows, and I think it became, like, apparent at some point that I would be able to, like, take on more responsibility than just, like, writing and producing or whatever. And so and because I think, like, some people didn't have a ton of experience on that show, that was, like, their first TV experience or one of their first or second shows that they had worked on. I think, like, one of the things that kind of got shunted off to me was a hard job, which was firing talent and, that wasn't working out, or trying to save talent that was like maybe on the bubble, and also casting new talent. So that became, a thing that was my responsibility, and it was interesting. It was really interesting just to be able to, sort of take a hard look at what was working and what was being used on the show and what was making an impression on people, and then sit down with this kid, John Mulaney, and put him on tape, and then, bring him to executives and have them like all vote, and to have some people be like, okay, if you want to put that kid on, you can put that kid on, and then have other people be like, no, I don't think this is the right way to go, and blah, blah, blah. And so, that was really the first time where I was like, I don't know what I was thinking, because I needed that job at the time. I had a family, but I was like, I think like it was like a thumbs down on John Mulaney. Like in the end, we were not going to hire John Mulaney. And I don't know why, it just like set me off. And I was like, went into this office of executives, and I was like, if we don't put this person on this show, I guess I quit, because I don't know what we're doing.
Wow.
I feel like I am not familiar with the mission that we're trying to accomplish if we don't put this person on the show. And they were like, okay, Miss Dramatic, like we could put him on the show. Go ahead,
And now they've got to recognize how right you were.
Maybe. I don't know. I'm sure everybody is all doing their own thing. I'm sure everyone now thinks that it was their idea to put John Mulaney on that show.
Well, that would be definitely a TV executive's MO. I brought him in. I remember seeing him and bringing him in. Like, what?
Well, it's so funny. I remember, Nick Kroll was so great, and he was so funny as, like, a panelist on the show. But then I remember going to see him do like improv and these like little one-man shows that he was doing, and he was doing so many of these incredible characters that I was like, shoot, I really want to like use these characters on the show. And so I just remember like trying to do so many things, trying to do bits on Best Week Ever, trying to like suggest pilots for Nick Kroll. And I just remember like this one executive being like, I don't get it. I don't think people are going to like it, whatever, blah, 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 blah. And me just being like, damn, you're wrong though. And I wish I had like the tools at the time, like better tools to just be like, let's take this somewhere else. But, I was still like kind of newish at trying to like sell shows or whatever. And so it ended up like not really going anywhere, and Nick stayed with the show for my entire time there, and we were so lucky to have them, to have all those guys, to have him particularly. But I was so happy when Kroll Show like was a show.
Yeah.
And it's so hard to resist not going into your contacts and calling that executive and being like, oh, just want to make sure you saw Kroll Show, the very successful show known as Kroll Show, featuring all those characters that you quote said, I don't get it. But it's like, but also like I failed to cast Amy Schumer on Best Week Ever. Like I think she came in for like a little tape thing, and I don't know, we could only like hire so many people that round or whatever, and so
yeah,
so
I mean, sometimes it's sort of like SNL didn't hire Jim Carrey. It's
exactly,
there's always somebody like that.
And the weird thing is like I don't even remember. I couldn't even say like, I'm sure she doesn't remember coming in, but I'm sure she was very young, and I'm sure that we probably went really quickly through whatever, like making a little tape with her. But I'm sure we were also like looking for something, and maybe we had like just hired a, somewhat similar.
Right.
feeling.
I mean, that's one of the casting things that people don't really fully understand sometimes. It's like, well, we have like, it's really like putting together a team, a football team or something. It's like, well, we have a quarterback. Like we have a great quarterback. We're not looking for a quarterback right now. We need a different position filled. And so I get that, but it is always like, you look back, you could say like, oh, We could actually had Amy Schumer on our show. That could be tough, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the wrong decision. It's when you look at someone as talented as Nick Kroll and say, I don't get it, that you're just wrong. Like that has nothing to do with the position you need to fill. You're just wrong. Well, I could talk to you for a million years, and I want to, but I guess can't because of time and how that works.
Well, another time.
Yes, I would definitely love to talk to you more. But this seems like a good time to transition into the end where we try to create something together. However, there's so much that we've talked about. I'm not sure what we could create. I kind of want to go back and think of if we were going to do a show involving Prince, what it would be. Yeah, let's think about it that way. Like thinking about the shows that you've worked on and done, even including like a Best Week Ever. If it was going to be a Prince-focused show, what would we create?
Well, I mean, one of my greatest regrets with, losing Prince at all is devastating.
Yeah.
But he was just gone too soon.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I'm really sad about is that he did not get to do a ton of film scoring, which I just think he would have been incredible at. If he could have had like a whole side career. He had like a million side projects and million side careers, like songwriter, composer, so
designer.
Yeah, exactly. But I always think that he would have done really charming children's material.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, as someone who loves Muppets, I'm sure you saw when he did Starfish and Coffee with the Muppets.
Oh my gosh, yes, of course.
That's one of the most joy-filled things I've ever seen.
Yes, that whole episode of Muppets Tonight, and he was also like a big fan of animation, and he loved the Muppets.
Yeah.
The first live performance of Paisley Park was a touring performance of Muppet Babies Live that he called in to like perform for people's families. Yeah, so
wow.
So that was always a thing for him.
That explains Questlove's story about trying to DJ and Prince saying like, "Oh, put on Finding." I think it was Finding Dory.
Nemo.
Oh, it's Finding Nemo.
Maybe Finding Nemo or Dory. Yeah. So I think that he probably would have been an excellent person to build a children's show around, because not only did he have this like incredible imagination, I think he was really always in touch with what it felt like to be young and felt like to be the type of kid he was, who was kind of an outsider. And that's one of the reasons why I love writing for kids. Right, I love to like write a young adult novel once in a while.
Right, we didn't get around to talking about that. You've written a couple of books and you're doing. Yeah, I mean, it's and it's because like I think like I just don't have that thing where I just remember everything, and I remember very clearly what it felt like to be 4 or 5 or 15, or, I'm really in touch with that. And I think that he was always really in touch with that, which is one of the reasons why his lyrics are like next level. Some are filthy, but he has some really beautiful just turns of phrase that are like, wow, like, just the way that he was able to describe feelings in so few words. And so I really think that would have been like a transformative project for him, a children's show with Prince. I completely agree, and I think you would be great at running that, especially with your love of all things television, kids television. What would the name of the show be?
Oh my gosh, that's
Prince Show, I guess, is taken by the SNL sketch.
Yeah, that's a good question. Maybe Dream Factory?
Ooh, That's a good one. Well,
maybe like a Willy Wonka type of, fantasy land, which is kind of like what Paisley Park is. And, there are several rooms and areas of Paisley Park that had at one time or another been devoted to kids and like play spaces for kids. And so I think that would have been, like maybe a mostly musical show called Dream Factory.
I love it. I'd watch it. There it is. Thank you so much for being on the podcast, Caissie. I adore you, and you've been so great to me and really encouraging, and I just think you're the best.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's so nice to talk to you.
She's so great, right? She is one of my favorite guests and just a big inspiration. So great. She has a couple of books that you can check out: United Jokes of America and Jane Jones, Worst Vampire Ever. You can also follow her on Twitter @Caissie and on Instagram @InstaCase. Check out the bio to spell those right. Also follow the podcast @ThereItIsPod on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and subscribe to our Comedy Life newsletter. We made this newsletter with comedians, actors, and creatives in mind. It offers tips on comedy, performance, and life, like how to work out in your home, best practices for your job search, and more. Link in bio to find out more. Pop Talk episode next week. Until next time, be good to each other.
The music for the theme song was created by Neil Brooks. The rap was written and performed by Nick Acevedo. The logo for There It Is was created by Jeff Prater. The There It Is podcast is produced by Jason Farr.